Good evening, friends and neighbors. I'm David Summergrad, he, him, and I'll be one of your hosts this evening. Our conversation series is called At My Neighbor's Table, and this is the 8th table conversation we have held, and our first one using Zoom, and our first without food. Please bear with us if we encounter any technical difficulties this evening, as we are still learning to use this technology. Please note that we are recording the large group portions of the evening, but we will not be recording the small confidential breakout sessions. Our topic tonight is an urgent one: unpacking structural racism, exploring and deconstructing white privilege and power. And before we begin, we want to acknowledge the many groups who have participated in helping to put this together and provided support for us to do so. It's quite a list, and we really appreciate everyone who has made this possible. Before we get started on this important topic, let's take a minute to reflect on the challenging work we are undertaking together. We will be led in a moment of reflection and devotion by Reverend Darren Stylianopoulos from the First Baptist Church of Needham, co-president of the Needham Interfaith Clergy Association. Darren, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for allowing me to be with you. My religious tradition, Christianity, is founded on the belief that we are created and called toward a newness of life. What some might call the founding event of my faith, the resurrection of Jesus, is all about that even death cannot keep us from the possibility of new life. Earlier this year, my daughter got to Zoom with her world history textbook author. And she asked in the course of their conversation, "Does history give you hope for the future?" He almost immediately responded, "No." And then he began to explain about all the times throughout history that humanity has failed to change in time or failed to right wrongs, and just how many times we have repeatedly fallen into patterns of violence and injustice. And then my daughter asked a follow-up question. She asked, "Are we doomed to keep repeating our failures and mistakes? Or do you think we can change those cycles?" I'm not going to tell you what his response to her was, but I am going to bring her question to this conversation, because I think that we are all here with that question in our hearts. Can we change? You're all here because you're curious, I think, and because you care, and because you question on some level the patterns and deeply entrenched ways of thinking and being that have contributed to a great deal of brokenness in our world. Literally, the breaking apart of humanity. And I think that we are here because on some level we're wondering if it's possible to find new realities, new ways and patterns of living that mend that brokenness, particularly around race and systemic and structural racial injustice. I will say that if I were here by myself, here alone, I would feel a lot like that world history textbook author. But I'm not here alone, and neither are you. We are here together this evening because nearly 200 people gave up their evening to come and think and work and have conversations with each other in a really intentional way. We are here because we have committed to do hard and difficult work and humbling work. And we are here together. And that gives me a great deal of hope. Because where there are so many hands and so many hearts and so many minds focused and intentional about removing and digging up those deeply entrenched ways and patterns of being that are harmful, I think we can make our world a better place. We can change. We can be a part of a newness of life. And for that, I am grateful. Blessings to you.
Thank you, Reverend Darren. That was exactly what we needed. Much appreciated. I want to thank you all for making the time to be part of this critical conversation this evening, coming as it does at this hinge point in our nation's history and in our community. The challenges and opportunities before us are unprecedented, and I believe that we have a chance to act boldly and swiftly to confront systemic racism in our country. George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Rayshard Brooks are the names we are talking about today. Whose names will be next? Enough is enough. The conversations we hope to have tonight will help move us forward toward a more fair and just society. We are all on a learning journey, and we're all in different places in that journey. The content we will be discussing is filled with lots of emotions and much passion. We hope to create a safe and brave space for our conversations this evening using these norms. And I will just very briefly walk us through this slide, starting with this statement. As a principal of a school, we had a set of expectations and norms, but essentially they all boiled down to treat others with respect. And I think you'll see that that's true of these norms: to listen respectfully, to allow for different opinions, to try on different points of view, and to assume and have good intentions. There's one norm that we added that we haven't used at previous meetings, and it's a Zoom norm, because Zoom is tricky. We don't always get the cues that someone else has finished, and so please pause and try to avoid cutting each other off when you're in your breakout rooms later. It's good to raise your actual hand so that your table leader can recognize you. So I think if we can, and these norms are going to show up in the chat when we go into breakout rooms, so people can refer to them as a way of just monitoring how we interact. But thank you for that. We're all still gaining experience using norms, using Zoom, I should say. And so we have put together a short primer of Zoom tools and etiquette. We expect over 200 participants this evening. So as we did at the beginning, we need everyone to please set your audio on mute. And if necessary, we can also mute all. Use the chat feature to let us know, as some people already have, if you're having a tech problem, and we will try to help with that. And please note that chat comments, I believe, can be seen by all. So just know that everybody will read what your question is or your concern is. Once you're in the breakout rooms later on, you should unmute yourself. And when the breakout time is done, the time runs out and you automatically come back to the main room. But if your group finishes a little early, you can click on return to main room and then mute your audio again. And as you will see at times, our presenters may share items for all to see, as I'm doing now. Speaking of our presenters, we are fortunate to have two special people with us this evening, experienced with this kind of conversation. And we welcome Lisa Biebold, a licensed psychologist on the board of Forge, and she has co-facilitated numerous workshops on race and diversity. Welcome, Lisa. And as her co-facilitator and presenter tonight, we have Amy Behrens, the co-founder and former coordinator of Newton's Forge, and she advises the Forge board. And again, she has run many sessions, anti-racism and other kinds of workshops for teachers, parents, students, and community groups. So we welcome you. We're very excited for you to help us along on our journey, and we turn it over now to you to take us for the next steps. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Figure out what was going on. Thank you all for inviting me and Amy this evening. I'm going to start us off. Amy and I will take turns at different points in the presentation. And I first want to start with locating myself. So as David said, I'm Lisa Biebold, and I have been doing diversity work for, I don't even know how many years at this point. But I say that to say I also live a life as a person of color. And so I identify as a Black woman. I grew up in Brooklyn, New York. My formative years were in the 70s and 80s. So that was a particular time that informs who I am today and my perspective that I both come to this work with and affects how I sort of see and locate myself today. I'm also, I've worked in schools, so my work in schools has predominantly been in communities of color. And it's a particular space that I value because many of the students that I have worked with are, again, in predominantly Black and brown communities, and often those communities are under-resourced in terms of access. So it's always been a very important a particular emphasis for me to work in Black and brown spaces and to provide and try to work for as much access to good quality teaching resources as possible. I also use the pronouns she, her, hers, and I think at this point I'm going to stop and I'll turn it over to Amy, and then we'll pick up with the rest of the program.
Thank you, Lisa. And thank you, Lisa, for inviting me to join you here tonight. I feel really excited to be with all of you in this format. It's exciting. So my name is Amy Behrens, and I go by she, her. And I grew up in Baltimore, Maryland. And I was aware from a very young age of the patchwork quilt nature of Baltimore, where there are white areas, and then you could go over one road, and then you'd be in a Black area. And then there are also areas like Little Italy, and then there are areas where more Asian people lived. And I became disturbed by just the disparity in who had privilege. I started being aware of that as a young girl. And then I was also aware that I was growing up in a white neighborhood and going to largely white schools. And I had my first African-American friend in 7th grade. And I just was aware that I was missing out on knowing more people. And I went on to, and then I think my main access point growing up was through literature, to knowing more people's experiences. And it was in college where I joined with some other students of color to form Students Organized Against Racism, a chapter at my college. And we started doing prejudice reduction workshops, and that really opened my eyes to more people's experiences and really thinking about how do we reduce prejudice in order to make a more just world. And from there, I was seeking connection with a wide variety of people, and I learned about the Baha'i faith. And so the Baha'i faith believes in the oneness of religion, the oneness of God, and the oneness of humanity. And there's a real emphasis on really creating justice in our world, and that really appealed to me. And it was through the Baha'i faith in Baltimore, where I moved back after going to college, where I started going to people's homes in inner city Baltimore, where I had been told to be afraid. And then I was actually going to people's homes and seeing that they're just like me, and really loving a wider variety of people who were very economically different from me ethnically. So that really, and we also started a Baltimore Institute for the Healing of Racism. So it's been just a real passion of mine. And from there, I went on to become a middle school teacher. And I was teaching in an inner city school in Boston, and then I ended up teaching in Wayland. That's where I know David Summergrad, because we worked together in Wayland. And in Wayland, I was working with the METCO program and really supporting the students, but just seeing, again, like there's this achievement gap, and seeing that there is a disparity between the experiences. And that just has been something that I want to spend the rest of my life working on. And I got trained in Wayland to become an ideas instructor. At that time it was EMI, and we teach teachers who are part of the METCO program, all the METCO schools, how to become more anti-racist and how to teach multicultural education. And since then, I've become a parent coach. So now I work with families, helping them to achieve greater happiness and unity. And I've continued to do anti-racism workshops and then helped form Forge, the Families Organizing for Racial Justice in Newton. And that's been a way to bring all 23 schools in Newton together, families who are interested in working against racism. And that's where Lisa and I have connected. And we both serve on the Forge board together and are working with a multiracial team of people to reduce racism in Newton and to try to build systems, which is what brings us here tonight, systems that really are transformative and really creating the equity that we want to see in our society. I'll stop there.
Yeah. Thank you, Amy. And so also I should add that I have been a teacher, and a part of my work in the classroom also helped to shape some of the ways that I perceive and understand structural racism, because I've been in the systems that obviously are impacted by it. So with that, I'd like to share an overview of how we have structured this evening. We're here tonight because we are wanting to explore racist structures in our society and to better understand how racism affects each of us. We're going to also be looking at some videos that will give a little bit more of an explication of some of the terminology that you'll hear this evening, and we have some slides that will provide definitions so that we're all using and understanding the language from a common and shared understanding. And through our conversations together, we hope to generate steps that we can each take to create an anti-racist society and make anti-racist structural changes. We will also, after looking at the videos, break out into the breakout spaces where you can have a 20-minute long conversation with each other, and we'll have those structured by some guiding questions that you can all reflect on. And if you are feeling uncomfortable with answering the questions, please contribute by asking some questions that will help further the conversation, because there's no question in this space that is not a smart question. All questions are welcome because we're all learning together. And then after we are in our breakout rooms and we have that reflection time, we'll come back together and we'll discuss white privilege and how it operates. And then we'll watch another couple of videos, go out into the breakout rooms again, and you'll be in the same breakout room as you were in the first with the same people. And then we'll come back together before we leave for the evening. Amy, do you want to share the goals?
Yes. So tonight we hope to create a better understanding in each of us about how we have been and continue to be affected by living in a racist society in which white people receive benefits which are based purely on the color of their skin, and people of color continue to experience discrimination on many different levels. We are hoping to provide opportunities to look within ourselves and also examine our own lives, and then also outside of ourselves to learn from each other about our experiences. Some of you may have heard about windows and mirrors, and so the mirrors are looking within and then the windows are looking beyond. And we hope that each of you are able to identify one step or more that you can take upon leaving tonight to work on against structural racism. I think we grow up hearing more that, or many white people grow up thinking of racism in terms of personal acts of bias. And we're really looking at the systemic ways that our society is structured to perpetuate bias. And so we want to help you generate ideas to think about how you can leverage the various different ways you have power to create justice that is deeper in a more systemic way. So we thank you for joining the conversation tonight, and we hope you enjoy learning from each other along with us.
And so the first, I'm just going to give a brief synopsis of the videos, and then we have some slides that will review the vocabulary that you'll be introduced to in these videos. So the first video is What's Structural Racism? And Dr. Emily Owens is going to really sort of look at and give an overview of structural racism and how it shapes our lives. And she'll also use the language structural and and institutional racism kind of synonymously. And you'll see in the slides as we go through the definitions that they are interchangeable. Systemic racism is also another kind of language that is often used with structural and institutional racism. The second video is Systemic Racism Explained. And that's more of a cartoon-like concrete representation of how the structural components really do shape our lives. And so we're looking at one community. There's one Black child and a white child growing up in different neighborhoods, not unlike Amy's, where just down the street there is, you have your white community, and just down the street there's a Black community. But how these communities are shaped by these institutional and structural frameworks that also have consequences in terms of schooling and education and access. And then the third video is by Robin DiAngelo, and she is an anti-racist worker. She's done all kinds of, she has the author of White Fragility and many other books. But she gives her location as a white person, and she really speaks to her experience in this first part of the clip, and how in the United States she's afforded privilege solely because of how she appears and her skin tone. And she speaks a little bit about how those systemic institutional structures are also empowering. And so she'll introduce the concept of power as well. And so I think with that, we should probably move to the definitions. All right, so structural racism is a system of societal structures that work interactively to distribute generational and historic advantages to groups of people based on race. Oh, Amy, I think I did that out of turn.
Oh, don't worry. I can just do the next part. It is a system of hierarchy and inequity that routinely advantages whites while producing cumulative and chronic adverse outcomes for people of color. I think that that is worth just reading again to really think about it. I think we could spend the rest of our lives working on this. So that's what we're doing. It is a system of hierarchy and inequity that routinely advantages whites while producing cumulative and chronic adverse outcomes for people of color.
Systemic racism refers to the rules, practices, processes, or procedures that advantage one group and disadvantages other groups. And in this case, we're talking about people of color.
Institutional racism occurs within social and governmental institutions and refers to the blocking of people of color from the distribution of resources in a systemic way that benefits whites.
White privilege refers to whites' historical and contemporary advantages in access to society's legal and political institutions. There is preferential treatment of white people based solely on their skin.
White supremacy is an historically based, institutionally perpetuated system of exploitation and oppression of lands and peoples of color by white people in nations of the European continent for the purpose of maintaining and defending a system of wealth, power, and privilege. And I see someone asking in the chat about the definitions, and we will make sure you get these definitions.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Implicit bias or unconscious bias, so again, those are used interchangeably, is an unconsciously held set of associations about a particular group. We're not consciously thinking about them, but we have these associations when we see particular groups. Implicit biases affect human behavior throughout society, including in classrooms, workplaces, and the legal system. Again, there are a few other words that may come up in the conversation, prejudice and privilege. So prejudice in this case are attitudes, opinions, or feelings formed without adequate prior knowledge, thought, or reason. Amy, do you want to do privilege?
Yes. Systemic advantages, benefits, or immunities that result from being a member of a non-target group or a group that has power.
So I know it feels like a lot of information, but in the context of the videos that you're about to see, it'll start to make more sense.
Structural racism is a way of describing the ways that ideas about race, and in particular ideas about white supremacy, shape the structures that are part of our lives. So one way to think about that, and I think the clearest way to think about that, is to think about institutions or institutional racism. So there are lots of institutions that we're a part of all the time: universities, schools, prisons, governments, that are part of our everyday lives, and that might seem on their face like they're just kind of neutral. But when you use the sort of lens of thinking about race and racism, you might see how those institutions produce or recreate or perpetuate or continue practices of race and racism. So in a contemporary moment, we might see institutional or structural racism in, say, an admissions process in a school or a university or a job market, maybe. In our contemporary moment, the kind of hip thing that people like to do is to say, we're being colorblind. We're not going to pay attention to race. So that means if a Black candidate and a white candidate both come and they apply for this job or they apply for this position in this school, then we are just going to close our eyes and pretend that we can't see race, and then it will be fair. But because of all of these histories and legacies and memories of race and racism that are really deep inside all of our brains and really deep inside the ways that our institutions are structured, they're all going to see race anyway. The people who are reading the application are going to see race, but also the kind of structures that the applicants have been through their whole lives have shaped them in racialized ways. So maybe someone went to a really good public school and someone went to a not very good public school. Maybe someone had a lot of resources for after-school programs and another person, didn't have those resources. So all of these kinds of structures have shaped their lives in ways that have to do with race before they even get to the admissions process. So then to kind of close our eyes and say, let's pretend race isn't here, actually enacts unfairness and perpetuates the racism. So I would say that's kind of how structural racism works today.
Jamal is a boy who lives in a poor neighborhood. He has a friend named Kevin who lives in a wealthy neighborhood. All of Jamal's neighbors are African American, and all of Kevin's neighbors are white. Because Jamal's school district is mostly funded by property taxes, his school is not very well funded. His classrooms are overcrowded, his teachers are underpaid, and he doesn't have access to high-quality tutors or extracurricular activities. Kevin's school district is also funded by property taxes, so his school is very well funded. His classrooms are never crowded, his teachers are very well paid, and he has access to high-quality tutors and lots of extracurricular activities. Kevin and Jamal live only a few streets away from each other. So how come they're growing up in such different worlds with such different opportunities for success? The answer has to do with America's history of systemic racism. To understand it better, let's look at what life was like for Kevin and Jamal's grandparents. Decades after the Civil War, many government agencies started to draw maps dividing cities into sections that were either desirable or undesirable for investment. This practice was called redlining, and it usually blocked off entire Black neighborhoods from access to private and public investment. Banks and insurance companies used these maps for decades to deny Black people loans and other services based purely on race. Historically speaking, owning a home and getting a college education is the easiest way for an American family to build wealth. But when Jamal's grandparents wanted to buy a house, the banks refused because they lived in a neighborhood that was redlined. So Jamal's grandparents were not able to buy a home, and because colleges could prevent them from attending through legal segregation, their options for higher education were really scarce. Kevin's grandparents, on the other hand, got a low-interest loan to buy their first house and got accepted into a handful of top universities, which traditionally only accepted white students. This opened up a wealth of opportunities that they were able to pass on to their kids and grandkids. Even as late as the 1980s, an investigation into the Atlanta real estate market showed that banks were more willing to lend to low-income white families than to middle or upper-income African-American families. As a result, today, for every $100 of wealth held by a white family, black families have $5.04. A 2017 study confirms that redlining is still affecting home values in major cities like Chicago today. This explains how Kevin and Jamal inherited vastly different circumstances. Unfortunately, the story doesn't end there. A big part of systemic racism is implicit bias. These are prejudices in society that people are not aware that they have. Let's go back to Kevin and Jamal. Against all odds, Jamal manages to be the only student from his high school to get accepted into a great university, the same one that Kevin and his high school friends are attending. But after Kevin and Jamal both graduate, Jamal notices that his resume isn't drawing as much interest as Kevin's, even though they graduated from the same program with the exact same GPA. Unfortunately for Jamal, studies show that resumes with white-sounding names get twice as many callbacks as identical resumes with black-sounding names. Implicit bias is one of the reasons why the black unemployment rate is twice the rate of white unemployment, even among college graduates today. You can see evidence of systemic racism in every area of life. The disparities in family wealth, incarceration rates, political representation, and education are all examples of systemic racism. Unfortunately, the biggest challenge with systemic racism is that there's no single person or entity responsible for it, which makes it very hard to solve. So what can you do? The first thing you can do is work towards becoming more aware of your own implicit biases. What are some prejudices that you might hold that you're not aware of? Second, let's acknowledge that the consequences of slavery and Jim Crow laws are still affecting access to opportunity today. As a result, we should support systemic changes that create more equal opportunities for everyone. Increasing public school funding and making it independent from property taxes would be a great start, so that poor and wealthy districts can receive equal access to resources. Systemic problems require systemic solutions. Luckily, we're all part of the system, which means that we all have a role to play in making it better. Peace.
I'm Dr. Robin DiAngelo, and my work focuses on the question of what does it mean to be white in a society that proclaims race meaningless, yet is profoundly separated by race. And to start this off, I want to draw your attention to the fact that I'm white. So just look at me for a moment, think about it, notice it. And part of being white is that it's a very uncomfortable thing for me to do. And it's taken me many, many years to be able to draw people's attention to my race and see any significance in it. And that's because as a white person, I was socialized to see race as what they had. I was just a person. I was just a white bread, a Heinz 57. I didn't have race. I was socialized to see race as individual acts of discrimination and prejudice, individual acts that anybody could do to anybody else, and if you did those acts, you were a bad person. And that is why, since I saw myself as a good person, I didn't see myself as connected to racism, and certainly didn't see myself as connected to race. In other words, I didn't have a sense of a racial identity. Today I understand that I move through the world always and most particularly as a white person. I have a white frame of reference and I have a white experience. And part of being white is to have that be invisible to us and to be able to live our lives without ever acknowledging that, to see that as non-operative. I now understand racism as a system, as a deeply embedded system, a system that our country was founded on and that all our institutions were created out of. And every institution reinforces this system. And it's a system of unequal power. So let me give you an example. Women in the United States got the right to vote in 1920. And there was only one possible way that we could have gotten the right to vote, and that was for men to give it to us, because we literally were not sitting in the seats of institutional power. We could not give ourselves the right to vote. That doesn't mean that we couldn't have personal power, but we didn't have institutional power. And that's the difference between a system and individual acts. Prior to women's suffrage, I could certainly discriminate against men, I could be unfair to individual men, but my group could not systematically deny men as a group the right to vote. And men controlled all the institutions, and they all worked together to convey the message that women's place was here and men's place was there. And that's the difference between individual prejudice and a system of inequality. So in this field, we think about oppression, or in this case racism, as group prejudice backed by institutional power.
Hi, everybody. We are going to go into the breakout rooms, and I am hoping that I have assigned people well. I've been working on that. I'm going to first post the norms and the discussion questions in the chat so that they'll be present for everybody in the breakout rooms. There they are. And then everybody's video should be off as we transition to the breakout rooms. I'm going to send you an invitation to join a room. So you're going to need to click on a button to accept the invitation. And then your breakout room number will be on the invitation. You don't have to remember that because your table leaders will remind you of it. So here we go. You have 20 minutes in these rooms with your table leaders. Here we go.
Why I have this image here now of under the water, you see the pillars or posts that prop up the surface, okay? So, for example, it's very common in discussions of race to have white people tell you about all the people of color in their lives, right? Oh, I have these coworkers, or my best friend, or my second cousin married a black man, or all of the ways that we want everyone to know that we have relationships with people of color. Okay? And so we're giving you evidence, right? When someone tells you that, they're giving you evidence. And so what are they giving you evidence of? They're giving you evidence that because they love people of color, know and love people of color, they can't be racist, which means they see racism as conscious dislike or explicit bias or hatred, right? And they're communicating to you that they don't have conscious dislike or hatred, as evidenced by all of these people in their lives. And what we don't understand is the power of implicit bias. Most bias is unconscious. And that makes it very, very dangerous because it drives our behaviors, but we're not aware of it. Yes, it's wonderful to have people of color in your life if you're white. Many, many, many people, white people, don't have people of color in close relationships. But that doesn't mean your life is free of racism. That doesn't mean you don't have a white experience or a white perspective. And it also doesn't mean that racism will not surface in your relationships with people of color. So if we go underneath and we look at the pillars that are supporting that kind of superficial ways that we're taught to think about racism, we see individualism as a very powerful prop or support, this idea that each of us is unique and outside of socialization. We see universalism, which is kind of the opposite of individualism. Individualism says, why can't we all be different? And universalism says, why can't we all be the same? This is a very popular ideology in religious or faith communities. And I'm not arguing that on a deep spiritual level, we're not all universally the same. But we don't live, if you will, in the spiritual realm. We live in the physical realm. And here in the physical realm, we have to ask ourselves, how does it function to say we all bleed under the skin? Well, it functions to take race off the table, to take power off the table, to deny that we have fundamentally different experiences because racism is real. And I think the most profound way that my life has been shaped by my race is through the power of segregation. Most white people do live in segregation. We choose that segregation, and in a lot of ways we celebrate it. What makes a school good and what makes a neighborhood good? Well, the absence of people of color. That is the way that white people measure the value of their neighborhoods and schools. And while we don't come out and name that, we all know what it is. And so I have had to think very deeply on what it means to have grown up in a primarily white neighborhood, to be born into, to go to school, to study, to learn, to play, to worship, to love, to work, and to die in segregation, and not have one single person who loved, mentored, or guided me convey that there was any loss. And I'm going to repeat that because I think it's very profound and I really want us to sit with it. That I could live my whole life in segregation. In fact, if I followed the trajectory that my loving parents laid out for me in my good neighborhood and my good school and my good college and my good career, in which I would ideally rise to the top, I could easily never have any consistent, ongoing, authentic relationships with people of color, and not one person who guided me ever conveyed that there was loss. Just sit with that for a moment.
You hear from his story how his skin privilege and how he shows up in the world has really, really worked in his favor. And I just want you to think about his story and just imagine what a young person of color might have experienced if he had been under the same circumstances. And then there's Shayna, who is from Buffalo, New York, and she's going to speak to some of the hierarchy in our society. And she's sort of asking a question about race.
There's been plenty of times where I have consciously taken advantage of the fact that I was white and you know, always kind of knew that if I got in trouble that I could just get a lawyer, suit up, show up, and you know, it was a slap on the wrist. I would be in jail if I wasn't white. You know, I've been arrested probably over 20 times. And, you know, the only thing I have on my record to show for it is a public intoxication. And there have been some hefty drug possession charges, and I've never served time. I sold drugs. You know, I basically did whatever I wanted to do, knowing that there was going to be absolutely no consequences, you know, as what kind of the past showed me. I never felt guilt at the time because I never thought about it. But now that you mention it, there is a little bit of guilt in there, just because, you know, me talking about it openly is making me realize, damn, I'm pretty lucky.
Some whites are very exclusive, you know, within the white community. For example, if you are not white and Christian and of a certain income, then you'll be excluded. This country has been dominated by white male indoctrination. And so, what is the discussion? You know, you have laws, legislation, you have the whole basis of the country being created by white males. So at what point does that whiteness need to be discussed? It's everywhere. Being a male and being white, you know, it's still here, whereas being a female and being white is kind of still here. I feel very uncomfortable when there's too many only white people in a room. Like right now, I'm kind of like, where's everybody else? Talking about race, not anybody else in here.
So we're going to return to the breakout rooms, and this time we're going to be talking about how has white privilege and or hierarchies in society affected your life? Lisa, you want to read the other question?
Sure. What is one action you would like to take to counteract your white privilege or create greater equity in a group you are a part of?
We're going to give you 20 minutes. We know that you were thinking that you might be leaving at 7:30. If you need to leave, you certainly are welcome to leave. We will be, it sounds like there'll be links sent out. And if you can stay for another 20 minutes, and then we'll also come back together for another 5 to 10 minutes to process what happened in the group. So if you're able to stay till 8, we'd love to have you. And if you can't, we hope to see you and wish that you continue the conversation.
Absolutely.
We are into overtime, so I'm going to, unfortunately, wrap us up. We just dropped under 100, so I know people have got to go. And I'll just throw in as we're talking, I have a mantra of no guilt, take action. Like I get that people may feel guilty as we learn about this history and get deeper, but we need to actually do something. And I thank you for your comments about the nuances of being an ally. Very helpful. I want to thank all of you for attending this evening, this special event. And I particularly want to thank Reverend Darren again for her call at the beginning for hope for us in this process. We're not alone, and we can work together to make changes. I hope everyone feels it was a worthwhile evening. I know that I learned a lot, and I want to thank Lisa and Amy, our two fabulous and skilled presenters, and we can
Thank you.
let you know how much we appreciate you. I'd also like to thank all the members of the Planning Committee, with a special shout out to Randy Light and Dan Carmen for everything they did behind the scenes this evening to keep our Zoom technology on track. We didn't have too many glitches. I'd like to thank each of the organizations that supported this event. We need you, and we need more organizations as well. And I want to thank our table leaders for facilitating the conversation in the breakout rooms. Well done. A dear friend of mine often said, if this stuff were easy, we would have solved it long ago. So as we noted in the norms, we shouldn't expect closure from this kind of conversation. Hopefully this evening will have launched some new beginnings and new thinking for all of us. And I want you to know that the committee is planning a follow-up session as well as a video session for those who were closed out of this evening's event. We'll get the word out to you about those sessions as soon as possible. So your homework, please talk about this evening with others. Share what you learned tonight and what actions you plan to take as we all strive for a more fair and just world. And again, thank you for coming. Look for more emails, and table leaders, we're going to send you a questionnaire to hear about how tables went, but thanks everyone for your time, your energy, and your commitment to this work. And again, thanks Lisa and Amy for making time for us.
Thank
you. Good night.
Usually I say safe home, but I think people are home.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Thanks, David.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, David.
Randy,
Lisa,
thanks,
Amy,
Good night, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.